Class, how is everybody? This cold, beautiful Friday. I think it's like 41 degrees. This is going to be ethics. I'm going to be teaching on chapters, hopefully, 5 and 6. We're going to be talking about ethical egoism as well as the social contract theory. Ethical egoism is one of my favorite chapters to actually teach on, and looking forward to doing it. So, real quick, try to get all of your grades in here pretty soon. I did actually mark up a lot of your all's papers. I think I marked up all of your all's papers. Good job. Again, I feel like you guys are learning the process really well as far as putting the basically the grammar in the very beginning. When I say grammar, just what Rachel's is saying, and then you talk about the logic, which is how they construct the argument, and then after that, you guys have been really good at telling me the rhetoric, and that is what you all think about it. Again, that's just to get you used to writing and thinking like a philosopher. Hope you guys are enjoying the reading thus far. I know sometimes it could be a little confusing, sometimes it can be a little heavy, but we're already plowing right through. I mean, 2 weeks will be Thanksgiving, and after that, I think it's only like I think only 1 or 2 weeks left for school, and then you guys are done. So we're moving on up. So I want to talk a little bit about ethical egoism. So ethical egoism, in order to really understand it, you have to understand that ethical egoism has its roots in really kind of like psychological egoism. Ethical egoism does not occur just in a vacuum. Ethical egoism occurs because it wants to observe human nature. So just to kind of catch you guys up on where we are, we talked about subjectivism, and then after that we talked about motivism, and then after that we talked about the divine command theory, and then also natural law. So now as we're continuing to progress, we're looking more at what people are possibly capable of and what they're made of, and also what we should maybe command them to do. So it continues to kind of progress. It's not necessarily in chronological order. Ethical egoism is not something that's older than, like, say for example, social contract theory. It's definitely not older than the utilitarian approach or Kant's respective person. So the book is not necessarily written in a chronological way. It's just kind of, it's written in a way where it's getting you more aware on elementary views of what humanity is capable of. I hope that makes sense. So the book starts out with a question. The chapter starts out with a question. Do we have to, should people be commanded to like feed starving people? Now this is a pretty provocative question. Whenever I ask a lot of my classmates, if I were to teach this in a live class, I may ask all of you, do you think it's a duty for us to feed the poor? And it's a variety of responses that I get. A lot of people might say, most of the time what I get is almost half the class, or maybe 75 or 80% of the class usually would kind of like raise their hands and say, yes, it is a duty to feed the poor. It's our duty to do this. After this lecture, and you'll soon see why, I then ask the question again, and only about 20% of the students actually end up raising their hands. So we're going to kind of look at, some of the problems with altruism, and altruism is just basically the command when government or churches or whatnot commands people to take care of other people. Believe it or not, there is some problems with that. And we'll look at that. We'll look at the reasons why. And so, but where does that leave us? Does that mean that we all just kind of live selfishly, or do we live in a way that's unselfish, but do we do it willingly? And then after this, I'll talk a little bit about the social contract theory. So the reason why I start with that is because what we need to understand is that people respond to crises differently. And people respond to crisis in a variety of ways. So when you see somebody that's maybe impoverished, or when you see like an unethical situation, what a lot of ethicists will do is that what truly tells you about a person's character is on how or what that person does in those particular situations. But now what we're asking for is something a little bit more something that's a little bit more complex. Is, can I actually command people to do something that's supererogatory. In other words, if it's not necessarily for or against the law to, say, for example, give money to charity, should I be commanding people to do that when it's not necessarily um, go, when it's not necessarily a pure ethical command, right or wrong? In other words, I can't necessarily force people to do something like take care of the poor, take care of other people, be kind to other people, those types of things. So how does this stuff actually play into our conversations when it comes to ethics? Well, I actually think it's very important because we actually have a significant debate going on even in this country in regard of taxes. A lot of people maybe who take the more liberal stance would argue that tax money should be taken out of your paycheck to pay for people who are less impoverished, or excuse me, or more impoverished, not less impoverished, but who say, for example, I work at the hospital room, and I deal with people who are psychiatric patients, and a lot of them are on Medicare and Medicaid. We just call it in the hospital M&M. A lot of people that are in the emergency room don't work. A lot of them are unemployed. They're likely getting a lot of housing. They're on housing. And so that brings up the question, why is it my duty, for example, to take money out of my paycheck? Where are they getting this money? They're actually getting it from, if you work, a little bit of your income every single 2 weeks or every month, whenever you get paid, goes into the system, goes into, you're actually taxed for it, goes into the Medicare, Medicaid, and that's not just for you later on, that's actually for a pool of people that they basically take from. So the ethical question is, should we as a society, in order to survive, provide this kind of pool for people who may be unemployed or people who are working, who are not working but maybe using substances, and they're just kind of taking from that pool? So that really leaves a lot of very, very interesting discussions. Some people, for example, would say, well, if we don't provide this, they would be homeless, and then actually what you would create is more trauma, and that you would actually have much less, you would have more chaos in civil society. Other people say, well, that's not necessarily true. Actually, maybe one of the reasons why there is so many, quote, poor people, or a lot of these people continue to stay in this cycle, is because they're not being challenged. They're not actually pushed to work. And so they take advantage of the cycle they take advantage of the system that's extremely predominant in their lives, and they get lost in the system. And it's a big, big government that's actually keeping them in the system. And lo and behold, they're taking advantage of it, and then their children are taking advantage of it, and then you have whole generations of people taking from this pool of which you and I are, if you're working, are paying for. So the question is really kind of a governmental question, really. So it's a question on, should you and I be taking care of others, and should we be commanding that to other people? And that's what altruism is really about. Altruism is that you need to command other people to actually do things, quote, for the good of others. Okay? So ethical egoists don't like this philosophy. And so ethical egoists have some real problems with this, and we'll be talking about this a little bit more, because they actually think that what you're doing is that you're creating a culture of pity. You're creating a culture of kind of hypocrites, in the sense that I kind of pat myself on the back because I pay so much tax money to a government that takes care of the poor, and therefore, hey, I don't really have to deal with them. I could just love my wife, help my kids, but I kind of pat myself on the back thinking that I'm somewhat righteous because I've, quote, taken care of the poor. Ethical egoists don't really like this because it seems to create a culture of hypocrisy. But another reason why ethical egoists don't like this, or psychological egoists don't like it, is because it really kind of creates this command or this imperative on other people that you should somehow just sacrifice your time, sacrifice your money, sacrifice your resources for the good of others. And so what an ethical egoist would say is, well, why do you feel like you need to do that why do you feel like other people need to be sheep for other people? In other words, whoever said that you need to be living your life for others, where does that come from? And that seems to be creating a false sense of guilt. So we'll kind of talk about a little bit of some of the problems with this. So why are people ethical egoists? So ethical egoism is basically that people really only serve their own interests. So ethical egoists don't like the word altruism, or don't like how you command people to be altruistic, because ethical egoists don't think it's possible. Uh, People who are ethical egoists actually believe that we only think of one thing and one thing only: me, myself, and I. So they have a theory called psychological egoism that somewhat proves this. And psychological egoism is kind of the foundation. You have to understand psychological egoism before you could understand ethical egoism. So psychological egoism is basically, what are people like? So what psychological egoism basically says is that we really only do things for our own good, for our benefit, and at the end of the day, we really are more about our own self-interest than the interests of others. It doesn't mean that we don't ever actually do good things or don't do good things. It doesn't mean that we don't do good things, but we're really kind of doing it for us. So you probably have seen Hollywood actors, for example, who will pat themselves on the back. They have like this giant, they make sure that the press is there, and they have like this big, big paycheck that they're giving to like the Red Cross or giving to some organization. And they make sure that all the cameras are there, and they have this big paycheck. It's maybe like $2 million, and it's a lot of money. But is it really hurting that particular actor? Say, for example, Tom Cruise or Bruce Willis or something. Probably not. These guys are making like $200 million in some of these movies. I think Tom Cruise's last movie, the one that he just made, I think it was like something like $80 million or something. So he takes $2 million, make sure that everybody's there to kind of watch him, and he gives this money to other people. And what are we thinking to ourselves at the end of the day? If we're really honest with ourselves, we're probably not saying to ourselves, "Oh my gosh, Tom Cruise is such a wonderful man." I mean, in a sense, some of us might be saying, maybe some of you are. I know I'm not. I'm not like thinking, "Wow, what a moral person." I mean, I'm thinking deep down. I'm like, "Come on, Tom, you're kind of doing this. Why do you have to call everybody before you give this $2 million to the poor? Why can't you just do it behind other? Why do we all have to know about it?" So psychological egoism reads into this. It says, "Look, at the end of the day, the reason why you quote take care of people is because you just kind of want other people to look." Make you feel good. And it has kind of a point to that. You have to kind of ask yourself the question, why do you do good things? Is it because like you truly, truly, truly care for another person? Or is it because you feel like you have to do that thing? Say, for example, if you're passing on Cabot Street and you see a homeless person, and the homeless person says, "Hey, can I have some money?" What is really the reason why you may give them like some change or some money? Is it really because you truly, truly, truly care for that homeless person? Or is it because you're thinking to yourself, well, I'm buying some lottery tickets a little bit later. Yeah, and I need some good luck from my lucky stars. And if I'm good to him, maybe Mother Nature or God will be good to me. And oh yeah, here's 50 cents. So the question is that really loving your poor brother? So psychological egoists will be like, no, it's really not. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't do that thing, but at the end of the day, we really do good things because it benefits us. And that is a pretty powerful argument. Maybe if I could take this home a little bit more, say for example, so I'm a marriage therapist, and I have a lot of couples that will come in, and it's amazing when I deal with like parents, for example, who may have like a child that has significant substance abuse problems. Most of the times, the parent has such a problem actually keeping their kid accountable. Say, for example, the kid is like a 20-year-old, 29-year-old guy living at home, taking advantage of mom and dad, stealing from mom and dad, even sometimes physically assaulting mom or dad. And mom and dad, at the end of the day, can't kick him out of the house. Why? It's not because they don't love, quote, Bobby. When you really, really get down to it and you really kind of hear their heart, they can't do it because they would feel so guilty. All right? Because if I put a boundary on him and if I really kept him accountable for his actions, I couldn't live with myself and I couldn't go to sleep. You see some of the problems with that is that, and so that's where psychological egoism really challenges us, is in the sense like, do you really do anything that's not for your self-interest? Okay. So it leads to the second question: is altruism ever possible? And so it gives an example of somebody that, of several examples of people just doing some amazing things for others and doing it, making these huge sacrifices for other people. But the question is, what do they do it for? Again, psychological egoism does not say that good cannot occur. What it's saying is that none of us are truly, quote, altruistic. And that none of us just do anything from just pure motives. We really kind of do it to make sure that we're doing it kind of for ourselves as well. And so, the argument really is that we just kind of do things that we, at the end of the day, really want to do. Now, the author has some real problems with this, because there's some holes, and I actually think he makes a pretty good argument here. If it's true that we only do what we want to do, how do you explain sacrifice? So if it's really true that altruism is just not possible whatsoever, how do you explain, like, somebody that goes off and serves in World War II? If you take a soldier, for example, that gave up his, in many instances, giving up their own lives, or giving up their time, giving up 4 years of their lives, giving up putting themselves in risk that they could lose their arm, that they could lose half of their body, that they could be paralyzed from the waist down. Are you really saying that none of those acts, that those acts are really, at the end of the day, just from, quote, selfish motives? And so the author really challenges maybe where psychological egoism says, where it's coming from, because it does seem that people, how do you explain sacrifice? How do you explain, if a homeless person is at the T, and this actually happened, I think here in Boston, and this person was actually about to die from the train coming in, and a guy actually picked him up and he threw him up at the very top of the pavement, and really risked himself getting hurt and killed, really, and the other person. And so he just did it immediately. How do you explain that stuff? I mean, if people are just really for their self-interest, you can't explain any of those things. Now, I want to but at the same time, so I'm going to play the devil's advocate here, because I think Rachel's kind of misses where psychological egoists, what he or she might say. A psychological egoist would actually say, yes, sacrifice actually does occur, but it's still for that person's self-interest. And that doesn't have to be always a bad thing. So the people that sacrifice their time, sacrifice their energy for America, for example, and during World War II, they wanted to do it, yes. And they did make a sacrifice, yes, but they still did it because there was a choice that they were simply involved. They weren't simply just giving up their whole will, their whole choice, and their whole personhood for a particular greater cause. They were actually choosing something that they thought would benefit, at the end of the day, themselves and their family. Okay, and that's the beauty of sacrifice. So psychological egoists would not say necessarily that's wrong. Where psychological egoists, again, I think Rachel's kind of misses this, where psychological egoism would say is that you can't command other people. Now I'm not talking about war, I'm not talking about the draft or stuff like that. You can't command people to do something, quote, good, when it's in their interest to only kind of, when it goes against their own natural interests. So we'll talk a little bit about that a little, There's no justification to kind of command or force people to do good things. That's outside the law. Yes, we can command people to do things that are inside the law, but we're now talking about outside the law. But the question is, not only this, I'm not going to lecture on this forever, but I would love to get your feedback. Do you think that altruism is actually possible? And when I say altruism, truly thinking for the good of that other person. At the other end, we have to be careful, because is altruism only thinking of only the other person? Okay, is altruism just purely thinking of other people and not thinking of yourself? And how is that altruistic? So, is it altruistic to just give all of your energy and all of your life to somebody else without actually giving something for you in return? So you see the problem with an either or here. I think there are people that say altruism is defined by me giving and giving or doing and saying something that's purely for the other person. But the problem with that is that really how altruism looks like? Or is altruism somewhat of a reciprocal relationship in the sense that I give and I get something in return, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's selfish per se, if that makes sense. So I want to be a little bit more disciplined here in the language, is because this is where I think people miss one another. Somebody that says that ethical egoists only think of themselves, that's not necessarily true. They actually think that you should give to others, and then in the sense that actually feeds you in return, because you can't actually make a choice outside of that. There's nothing that you can do where there's not some force of reciprocity. But is it purely, quote, selfish, as some psychological egoists say, or is it purely altruistic in the sense that altruism is defined by me just doing everything for the good of the other person where it doesn't involve me? So I'd like to kind of take a knife right here and say you guys are both kind of missing one another. It's actually somewhat both. You do things good for the other people. You do expect something in return, but that doesn't mean it's selfish, nor does altruism have to be defined only by me giving everything to somebody else without also kind of involving me as well. Hope you guys can follow that. So there's three arguments. So psychological egoism, if I can get back to that, psychological egoism is, at the end of the day, we do really only think of ourselves, which then gives the foundation for ethical egoism. All right. So ethical egoism has some problems with altruism. We'll get back to that. So altruism is just kind of saying that you should just give your time and your energy for other people. The reason why is because the first one is that the argument for that altruism is self-defeating. It's self-defeating in the sense, that I was alluding to earlier. It's self-defeating in the sense that you can't ever really truly prove it, because you are kind of involved in all the decisions that you make. That's basically what Rachel's is saying. So the other thing too, the problem with altruism is, or ethical egoism, one of the proponents of ethical egoists is Ayn Rand, is that she really regarded the ethics of altruism to be really kind of a cancer. She used some very, very strong language that she thought that the ethics of altruism created a very she called it a society that is just geared to people's needs and demands, in a society that treats you like a, quote, sacrificial animal and penalizes him for his virtues in order to reward them for their vices, which means it's a society that's based on ethics of altruism. She calls societies that are based on altruism parasites, mooches, looters, brutes, thugs. Why? Because she actually thinks that a society that's built on altruism. So I gave an example of what altruism looks like by going to the hospital and then like somebody kind of just taking advantage of the system. If Ayn Rand actually saw that, if she actually came to the emergency room with me, she would be furious. And the reason why she would be so furious is because she would basically be saying, why are you sacrificing yourself, sacrificing your life for people that you just don't know? And why is that ethical? And she brings, I'll be honest with you, she brings a pretty damn good argument. Why is that altruistic? I mean, that's fine if you want to give your money to the poor. This is what Ayn Rand would say. If you want to go to your church and give money, great. If you want to give money to the Red Cross, fine. That's fine. But she really pushed, and she was very anti-socialism, and she was very communism, because what she saw, what these governments would do, is that they would guilt people into basically taking their money away and give it to other people that the government saw as unworthy, and it would create this culture of pity. And the pity would then be the thing that would feed the people that were, quote, unworthy, and the people that were working, per se, would then kind of go down, and they were commanded or demanded from those governments to sacrifice like sheep and basically their own time, while the government just looted and took from them to give to these other people, while all of society saw them as the ones who were the pitiful. Sounds like there's a lot of stuff that's happening on today, okay? And Ayn Rand has some really, really good arguments that you can't see or respect people if you view people that way. Because at the end of the day, Rand makes this argument, it's very, very similar to Friedrich Nietzsche, that if you look at people with a sense of pity, you actually are not honoring them. Because pity is the biggest insult you could do to other people. And the reason why is because I, quote, pity you because I don't actually think you have the power or the ability to do something on your own. And so I really want you to think about that. Why do we pity people? Do we really pity people because we care? Or do we pity people because it feels really good to kind of feel bad for somebody that may be lower than ourselves? And Ayn Rand saw right through it, and she called BS on it. And she said, that is not creating an ethical society when you create this kind of pity mentality. But the other thing, too, is that the ethics of altruism regards the life of the individual that may be sacrificed for the good of others. In other words, who the hell are you, which is Ayn Rand's argument, to tell others that you have to now sacrifice your paycheck, your time, your money for other people that you think need to be serviced? Who put you in that position? And who is the government to put themselves in that position? And why is that the job of the government to put themselves in that position? So these are Ayn Rand's some powerful arguments here. And so what she would say is, look, at the end of the day, you get rid of pity, you make everybody kind of responsible for themselves, you call out the hypocrisy, and you help people actually, and this is why she was a very, very strong capitalist and a free market society. She believed strongly in free markets for this reason, is because the only thing that you can actually give people is the ability for them to be resilient, and the ability for them to make choices, and the ability for them not to be dependent on everybody's handouts, but to make decisions on their own will, on their own choice, and through their own actions. And that is how good pride, is established. And when that occurs, Ayn Rand would say, you actually become a more altruistic person because you want to then give that to other people. In other words, you don't just give money to people who need fish. You actually teach them how to fish so they do it on their own. Okay. The other thing, too, is that ethical egoism is compatible with common sense morality. So if it's true that we only think about ourselves, and if it's true that we should, work on this sense of resilience, well, will you have a truly ethical society if you just tell everybody work for your own self-interests? Ethical egoists would say absolutely you would. And the reason for that is because guess what? The duty not to harm others, the duty not to lie, the duty to keep your promises. 3 duties that a society cannot, three duties where a society would not be able to function if they did not exist. Those are 3 duties that if they weren't established, you would not be able to exist in that society. But those are all duties: the duty not to lie, the duty to keep our promises, the duty to not do harm. At the end of the day, you're doing it also for your own self-interest. And so it creates a sense of common sense morality. So you don't want to lie to other people, not just because it hurts other people, but also because it would eventually really, really hurt you. If you can't trust the people that you're actually coming in contact with, there's no reason why you can argue that would somehow be a better civilization. And so it leads to some expectation when you're an ethical egoist that you will see good in the society, because when people are truly doing it out of their own self-interest, guess what? They're not going to want to harm you. They're not going to want to do things that are where they can't trust other people. Now, there's some inconsistencies here. Here's some problems. Some problems. One problem is some people might say that that ethical egoist promotes wickedness. So, in the sense that it's great that maybe your self-interest that you may not want to harm other people, but what if that is in my own self-interest? Okay, then what do you do with that? How do you stop somebody from committing murder, for example, if that's really what he thinks or she thinks needs to occur? How do you prevent that? The other thing is, some people would say that ethical egoism is logically inconsistent. You could read that section. The book actually does a pretty good job that it shows that it's actually not logically inconsistent. But I would say that the third argument is that ethical egoism is somewhat arbitrary, and that's kind of what I was saying in my first point. Is that arbitrary in the sense of you never really know what you're going to get when you have a bunch of people just acting with their own self-interest. Okay, some might do good, but some might do significant harm. So how do you bring all those together? And that is actually a really, really good segue into our next chapter, because that's a damn good question. That's a very good question. What do we do? Because what ethical egoism and psychological egoism is supposed to do, and what this chapter is really supposed to do, is that it's supposed to bring some skepticism, rightful skepticism, to your assumption that altruism should just be commanded. Okay, so let me ask the question again. And I guarantee if this is a live class, you would have a lot less students raise up their hands. Should you or shouldn't you command other people to just feed the poor? Or should you recommend it and help people reach their potential by helping them make choices and on their own, okay? And that you should show that could be beneficial for society. But is it your right, or is it the government's right, or is it anybody's right to command other people to be altruistic when one, true altruism doesn't seem like it really happened or occurs, especially when people are just wanting to do it for their own self-interest. So how do you actually bring about an ethical or civil society? Okay, how do you do it? So that leads us to the next chapter, which is the social contract theory. And I'll be a little bit shorter on this part. So Thomas Hobbes believed a lot of what ethical egoism or psychological egoism, what his premises were. In other words, he actually believed that there was such a thing as a state of nature, that people left to their own will, their own devices, their own desires, without any kind of intervention, would create a pretty chaotic and very unnatural environment and civilization. So he called that, though, the state of nature. And so he actually thought that psychological egoism was 100% accurate, that people left to themselves without any authoritative figures, without any parents, without any government, that anarchy would actually lead to a chaotic and even an evil civilization. And there's actually a lot of proof for this. I mean, one of my favorite books is Lord of the Flies. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie, but basically it's a bunch of kids, a bunch of young men, young boys who are stuck on an island, and there's anarchy. There's no parents around. There's nothing. And what ends up happening are some pretty horrific acts. I mean, these are kids that end up raping some of the other boys. They end up killing one of the boys. There's excessive amount of bullying that goes on. It's Thomas Hobbes' state of nature. Okay, when people are just left to themselves, they end up doing a significant amount of harm. When you go to Syria, when you look at ISIS, for example, how did ISIS get formed? Many people who actually worked for, who are now in ISIS, 15 years ago, these are the same people that had families. These are people that had loved ones. They actually had children. They were going to their temple. They were going to their mosque. They were good citizens in Syria. They were good citizens in Iraq. Some of the people that joined ISIS 5 years ago or 4 years ago, if you looked at their lives literally just 10 years ago, they're actually pretty model citizens. So what the hell happened? Jordan Peterson is a psychologist who teaches at the University of Toronto, and he has a series out on how all of us, would likely have supported the Nazi Party in the 1930s and 40s if we were actually living in that time. And it's a very, very humbling series that he makes, and some claims that he makes. And at the end of the day, I actually think Peterson is right, because when you have a government that is putting these kind of things in these young kids, that they're taking advantage of their ideas, and they're impersonating some pretty dictatorial claims. Over time, you're going to see the reins of the human heart, the wickedness of the human heart, just like really kind of increase. And you see examples of this all throughout the history of civilization. Whenever societies just kind of let go of any kind of boundaries, you don't see a decrease in crime. You see a significant increase of crime. So what is that? So Thomas Hobbes saw this. I mean, Thomas Hobbes, during his century in the 1800s, I believe it's the 1700s, so the 18th century, he saw this. I mean, he was living in a time before, we're I was about to say cell phones, but you guys all know this. But really, kind of before, he got to see how. I guess I can't remember which country he lived in. So he was right in between like the kind of the upper class and the lower class, and it was like the monarchy. He got to see how monarchy and democracy kind of merged together. In other words, and he did get to see certain civilizations that didn't have actually either kind of authoritative figure over certain people groups, and he got to see firsthand what happened in particular towns. So he was really in the midst of a lot of that. So he believed in a thing called basically the state of nature. And the state of nature is when you have no contract, no societal contract to rein in people's natural inclinations. And he said the state of nature would be awful. He said that the reason why there would be awful is 4 things due to human life. Number 1, there's an equality of need. Each of us needs the same basic things in order to survive. Okay, and and we all need food, we all need clothing, we all need shelter, and so on. The problem with that is that there's scarcity. There's a huge scarcity of that need. We might not feel that we have a scarcity of food or shelter, but there is when we look at it globally. The other problem is that there's an essential equality of human power. All right. So in other words, who is going to get those goods? Who will get? Way back in the 800s and 900s, right before the writing system actually came out, lords used to just go in and just kind of take advantage of many of the peasants. And so if the peasants actually had a pretty good product and they were going to have some on their land, they say, for example, if they sold hot beer or whatnot, the lords would go in there and take advantage of a lot of their taxes. And the reason why is because a lot of the peasants couldn't read, they couldn't write, and they just kind of gave to the lords. Another problem with a lot of those peasants, or a lot of what occurred way back then is that a lot of the lords didn't tell the peasants their actual rights. And so a lot of these peasants didn't actually even have to listen to some of these lords. They actually had to listen to the monarchy. And the monarchy may have not actually even agreed with what these lords were doing. And so these lords would just kind of come in and just kind of take and steal whenever they felt like it. And so it really becomes an essential equality of human power. Who actually is empowered dictates on what we receive or what we need to give. And finally, there's a limited altruism. So going back on altruism, you really can't depend on the good of other people to take care of you. Okay. The problem with limited altruism, is that I hope somebody, if I'm, say, for example, I'm a peasant, I hope this lord who's coming over to my house with his sword and his 20 other men, I hope he's in a good mood today. He isn't kill me or rape my daughter or wife or something. And I don't know if you guys ever seen the movie Rob. I think it's Rob Roy. It's a perfect movie of that, and what likely occurred way back in the 9, 1000, 1000, 1100 AD. Excuse me. And so what you have as a result, there's a limited altruism. You just kind of hope that the person with the power, the person with the resources, will actually be good to you, and that wasn't always the case. And so here's the problem. Hobbes saw all that, and he said, look, because of that, and because people are pretty selfish, we need something. We need a social contract. And social contract is that you as a society, we all as a society, in order for us to be unified, have to give up some of our rights for the rights of others, so that we can construct a society where basically we will agree to follow laws, pay taxes, because if we don't do this, our society will fall apart by our limited altruism and the increase of a state of nature. So Thomas Hobbes believed that we needed to have some kind of contract where, in order for a society to actually exist, all had to agree on in order for that society to thrive. Otherwise, you just get the state of nature. Okay? So it's pretty simple as far as why he believed that, and he believed it because he saw what state of nature or what true psychological egoism did. And you could read. He's got a fascinating dilemma on the prisoner's dilemma. Okay, and the prisoner's dilemma, what it's meant to do is that what that little dilemma conveys is it shows some problems with egoism, because when there are times when doing something that you think is for your benefit may really, really harm you. Okay, so that's what the prisoner's dilemma is all about. It talks about whether or not you should confess, and you don't know what your friend is going to do. I mean, that's really what the prisoner's dilemma is about. You have a friend that's in the other room, and you really hope he confesses, but if he doesn't confess and you confess, you only need like a year in prison. If you both confess, you only get 5 years. But if you don't confess and he confesses, you get 10 years in prison. And what the prisoner's dilemma is meant to convey is that sometimes doing something for your own selfish ambition actually hurts you. It hurts you, and that's what that dilemma is actually meant to communicate. Speaking of communication, the only way to stop this, the only way to stop the tyranny of the state of the state of affairs, the state of natural affairs, or to stop the tyranny of psychological egoism, is to have a communicative tactic, some kind of communication of different parties. In other words, people coming together and actually communicating what the expectations, what the boundaries are, so that I could do something that's best for me and my neighbor. Okay? So I make the best choice to grow in this society. All right? So that's really what the social contract theory is meant to do. And the social contract theory, the other thing too is it's not rooted in divine command theory. Social contract really just asks the question, what makes a society thrive? So Thomas Hobbes probably wouldn't have been against a lot of like the sexual mores, or if somebody's doing something in their own bedroom, Thomas Hobbes likely wouldn't care. He would be like, look, if it doesn't actually affect civil society, leave that alone. The only thing that social contract theory is really it's based on is very libertarian. If you guys know a little bit about libertarianism, libertarian is just like, look, if somebody wants to smoke weed, fine. If somebody even wants to do heroin, fine. That's libertarian, guys. I'm not saying. I'm just my job as a teacher is just to tell you, and then you guys figure it all out. So social contract theory is very libertarian in that sense. It just says, look, if it's not harming anybody, in the sense like you're doing it behind closed doors, and you've got you're using whether it's drugs or sex or whatever it may be, and you're doing it in your own private home and you're not actually harming other people, social contract theory would say that's okay. All right, that's okay. Now the question is, how does it affect when it starts affecting your own personal life? Then it becomes a little bit more complicated, but you get what I'm trying to say. It tries to separate your private life with your public life, in other words. And so it says, basically, the main question is, that it's rational if you agree to follow the moral rules because we benefit from living in a place where the rules are accepted. In other words, the rules that you really want to follow by social contract theory is rules that you want everyone to accept and everyone to follow, not just yourself, but everyone else. So you shouldn't put rules on someone if you yourself are not also expected to obey the same rules. So it tries to limit the law down to very simple categories. But the categories are, if you're going to do it, I need to do it as well. And those laws are the ones that we put in the very, very top. Okay? So I need to allow you to speak if I'm willing to speak as well. Freedom of speech, for example, is very our first two amendments are centered on this kind of theory. I have no right to tell you that you cannot speak unless I actually think that you have a right to tell me that I can't speak. Okay, so here's the thing with freedom of speech. I mean, a lot of people have these debates about freedom of speech. You know, should we allow people that we strongly disagree with to speak on campus, for example? Absolutely, you should, unless you're saying to yourself, I shouldn't speak as well. Okay, so that's social contract theory. You better let him speak if you think that you also have a right to speak. Otherwise, you should only take away his ability to speak if you think that other people have a right to say you can't speak either. Okay. So that's the power of social contract theory, but also kind of the force of it as well. And you can see why they try to differentiate between public and private life and whatnot. So that I'll end on this. That's the problem with civil disobedience. So civil disobedience then becomes the question on when do we actually disobey what we've decided to agree upon, for the good of that society. Because social contract theory is not really, once we kind of come up with contract, there's no getting away from it. We all need, in order for this society to thrive, we need to agree to follow it as best we can. So, but what about like civil disobedience? What about like people like Martin Luther King or Gandhi? And I'll just talk about Martin Luther King real quick. Martin Luther King, when he didn't pay, or when he went to jail and he quote broke some laws, the reason why and the laws that were being broken were something like the Jim Crow laws and stuff like that. The reason why he was breaking those laws, though, is because he actually thought the Jim Crow laws and some of the racist laws that were implemented in the South actually went against the intention of the Constitution. Okay, so Martin Luther King, the reason why he broke certain laws is because those went against the heart of what the Constitution was really about. Okay, and social contract theory says, absolutely, that is when you need to protest. You protest when you actually think the intention of our contract is going to be compromised. That's when you need to protest. But when you don't have a right to protest is when it's just your own personal opinions and you actually want to contradict or change the document by which we all have come together. Okay. That's social contract theory. I'll let you guys decide on whether you like it or you don't like it. So, yeah, I like teaching on ethical egoism. I do. It's just kind of fun. I love Ayn Rand. I mean, I don't know what I think about it, honestly. I mean, from a personal stance, I strongly believe that psychological egoism is pretty true. But kind of like what I was saying before, that doesn't necessarily mean that I can't be altruistic. How do we get through it is basically by, and this is where I think social contract theory disciplines what ethical egoism is trying to do, in the sense that, yes, we kind of think for ourselves, but in order for us to kind of protect us that from getting out of control is through some kind of documental, some implementation of a document that will bring us together in some way, so that there can be unity, so that there can be good altruism, that can be reciprocal between me and my neighbor and who else, and that's how societies thrive. So I hope you guys like this lecture, and looking forward to reading all of your journals. Thanks, y'all.